Hey everyone, Dr. Al here, and today I am making your week 8 PowerPoint. So, without further ado, let's get started. All right, so this week we're focusing on stratification, specifically poverty within the US and on a global scale. I'm going to do some housekeeping review and lecture today, and then I'll be sharing the exit passes with you, which will be the same link that's on our in-person PowerPoint as well, ending with reminders. So, in terms of housekeeping, make sure you're emailing me ahead of time if you miss class for any reason. This is a class that is half online, half in person. So while there is an expectation that you're doing your work virtually outside of the classroom, you are still responsible for attending our class each week. And in fact, I have an attendance policy. I do a sign-in sheet every week. I have the attendance policy, and if you miss too many classes, that will start to negatively impact your end of semester grade. And depending on how many classes you miss, you could end up getting dropped multiple letter grades based off of attendance alone. So that's just a cautionary tale. Be aware of that. And we'll talk more about like W's and dropping the class if you're too far behind and that sort of thing on an individual basis as needed. Um, Either through one-on-one conversations during class time or before class, after class. I also have office hours. You can always email me. There's all different sorts of ways you can be in communication with me. So just make sure you're doing that. We had midterm exam 2 due last week 7. So make sure you're checking eLearn and the grade book to see what grade you earned on that exam. You can do test corrections if you earned less than 70%. I will say if we get to the third and final midterm exam and you haven't gotten below a 70%, but you're sort of hovering in that C plus, B minus range, and you would like to do test corrections for a test, email me and I will take that into consideration because I know that students want to be able to do work in order to maintain a particular GPA or whatever you might need to do in order to keep your financial aid or scholarship and that sort of thing. I am caught up with grading, so we've been working through the discussion post issues throughout the semester. This week 8, during our in-person session, we will finally clear all of the discussion post stuff up, and I will start grading more strictly based off of the rubric, which again, we will discuss that rubric and the guiding documents more in depth during our in-person session this week 8. But for now, just know that I'm caught up with grading, including discussion posts 1 through 5. You'll be working on discussion post 6 this week during our in-person class, and so we should be good to go with regard to those assignments. And I've also been slowly working through any makeup work and things like that that students may have submitted. So just keep an eye on eLearn and our grade book. And if you notice any grading discrepancies, email me as soon as possible so that we can address that sooner rather than later. This is sort of getting to the halfway point in our semester. So I want to make sure students know where they stand in my class and that all the grading is up to date so you can make an informed decision about staying enrolled in our class or dropping and perhaps registering for a B term class if you need to do that. If you have anything you'd like to share with your classmates, be thinking about that, and then you have the option of sharing that during our in-person session, or if you don't want to do that, you can email me and I can share with students. All right. And I guess it is during our in-person session this week, it's sort of your last chance to work through discussion post issues. You'll actually be bringing your computer or whatever it is you need to complete discussion post 6 to class so that you can work on that assignment in real time with me available to answer questions. So just make sure that you come prepared to do that work. I will still take attendance. You will still get some information from me in a PowerPoint slide and all of that, so I can give you an overview of things. Then you'll have time to work. And the only way students can leave during the work time is if they come up to me, they bring their computer to me, and they show me not only is discussion posts completed and posted, but you actually have to highlight for me all of the different components of your discussion post so that I can make sure you're not leaving anything out in terms of answering all parts of the prompt or including your reference page and things like that. All right, so exit pass feedback. One of the students in one of my blended sections loves to give me fun facts, and it's really, I enjoy it a lot. So I'm sharing that with you all this week, or well, last week's fun fact is that on average, one person creates about 5 pounds of trash per day. So, we talk about recycle, reuse a lot, and we see signs for that up on campus. So try and reuse things as much as you can so you can maybe not be part of that average, part of that statistic. And then there was someone who said that they planned on meeting with me during my office hours, but they didn't say their name. And I really didn't have much people interacting with me during my office hours last week. So if that was you and you still need to touch base with me outside of class, make sure you're reaching out to me, either coming to my office hours. I have in-person and Zoom options. Or if those time frames don't work for you, you can always email me and we can schedule another day and time to meet. So my in-person office hours are Monday, Wednesday. Sorry, that should say 2:15 to 3:15. But I can do Zoom during that time if that's your preference. And then I have Zoom office hours Tuesday, Thursday, 2:30 to 4 p.m. Okay, uh, that's kind of it for the exit pass. Review, deviance, crime, and social control. So when we did review last week, week 7, I said that we could revisit the stuff from this chapter related to crime because I feel like we focused more on norms and sanctions and that sort of thing. So in order to get to the crime stuff, we have to first start with deviance, which is a violation of contextual, cultural, or social norms. Often stuff that is considered deviant gets codified into law, and if you do that deviant act or behavior, then you're breaking the law. And that's where crime comes in. So crime is a behavior that violates official law and is punishable through formal sanctions. So sanctions are the repercussions or the consequences of engaging in deviance, violating social norms, and if the deviance you're engaging in happens to be illegal, then that's when crime sort of comes into play. And then we have an entire social institution dedicated to this idea of like crime and deviance and things like that. We talked a little bit about this when we went over the Panopticon and Michel Foucault's work, because his work on the Panopticon is really rooted in how we construct modern day jails and prisons. But the criminal justice system is an organization or a social institution that exists to enforce a legal code. Now, that's sort of the most distilled textbook definition of the criminal justice system. From there, there's sort of 3 major components of the criminal justice system that we tend to study if we're studying criminal justice. And so that's law enforcement, courts, and corrections. So courts are sort of where you go to figure out, okay, you broke the law, what is going to be the consequence of that? And a judge, sometimes a jury, sort of makes those decisions. Law enforcement, those are the folks who are sort of on the front lines and in the community, making sure people are following laws and that sort of thing. We have, local police officers, we have state troopers, we have all sorts of different policing apparatuses in the United States. And then we also have federal agencies such as the FBI or the CIA, who are, all part of this apparatus related to the criminal justice system. And then we have corrections. So this is jails and prisons where folks are housed once they've been convicted of a crime. They've been found, prison is where people are housed if they have gone to court, they've been convicted of a crime, and they're serving their sentence. Jail is technically where folks go before they've gone to court and been convicted of the crime while they're awaiting trial. So a lot of folks who are in jail have not actually been convicted or found guilty of the crime they've been accused of. They simply can't pay money for their bail in order to get out of jail while they're awaiting their court date. And so we can start to think, of course, about inequities that exist within the criminal justice system as a social institution, which of course we often do in sociology. We can think about, well, if folks are housed in jails while they're awaiting their court date, but they can pay to get out, they can pay bail to get out, who is more likely to be able to make bail? And so we know that that disproportionately benefits wealthy folks, which ties into what we're talking about this week with poverty and social class and stratification and things of that nature. And then folks with less money are less likely to be able to pay money to make bail to get out of jail while they await their court sentencing. Now, one caveat, because in some Western countries, but especially in the United States, we have prisons that are overcrowded. Jails end up becoming a place where people will actually serve prison time. So they have gone to court, they've been found guilty, they've been convicted of a crime, they have to serve time incarcerated, and the closest prison to them is overcrowded, so they end up serving that time in jail. So that would be a situation where someone is actually serving time because they've been found guilty in a jail and not a prison. Now, some people will also await their trial in jail. They'll be found guilty, and then they end up only serving the time that they completed while they were in jail awaiting their trial. So that's also another thing that sort of complicates this jail prison dichotomy. All right. So if you would like to learn more about crime and statistics and things like that, and how these things all kind of go together, or how law enforcement agencies sort of help us in the field of criminal justice and sociology better understand crime, I encourage you to go to the websites for some of these policing agencies, because they'll often have databases with survey data that they've collected. For example, the FBI collects the Uniform Crime Report, which is data related to crimes on the federal level. And so we can use that data, we can analyze it to look at trends related to crime. What does crime look like in urban versus rural versus suburban areas? What does it look like in the north versus the south? What does it look like in Washington, D.C. compared to New York City, compared to Los Angeles? We can look at all of those things thanks to law enforcement agencies and the data that they collect. Oftentimes we see crime sensationalized in the news and in the media, which we touched on a little bit when we covered that a week or two ago. We covered the media. And so that's why it's so important to have access to actual data related to crime, so that instead of just making these sweeping generalizations to sell more newspapers or have more clicks on social media, we can actually say, crime rates are going up in this way, but there's sort of study in this other way. We can use actual statistics to tell a story about crime in the United States. And that's really important to think about, especially as we think about the role of the media and the narrative that is often told about crime. Okay, Chapter 9, investigative questions. So when we're thinking about stratification, we want to ask ourselves, what is social stratification? How is social class be produced? And how does it change? And I'll also point out to you all that this is actually the start of the talk that I gave when I was interviewing for my position here at Sinclair. Oftentimes when you're interviewing for a professor position, you have to do a teaching demonstration. So this was the beginning of my teaching demonstration. I always like to put that into practice if I can. And then this is sort of a continuation of that. So in terms of stratification, here's an overview. Social stratification is the systems of inequity that organize categories of people into hierarchies, reflecting intersecting lines of values and power based on race, class, gender, and other identity categories. And then, of course, this week, since we're focusing on poverty in the US and globally, we're especially interested this week in the role of social class and socioeconomic status. Social stratification persists across generations, and there are different types of stratification systems. So there are closed and open systems, which I'll talk more about in just a second. You can have ascribed or achieved status. So in some cultures, in some societies, you are born in a particular social class. You're born into some of these different identity categories, and there's no way of escaping it. You're born there, and that's it. However, in other societies, in other countries, it can be achieved. Social class, in particular, can be achieved. So you are born into one particular social class based off of your parents and their income and their wealth, but you do very well for yourself and you climb up the socioeconomic status ladder, or maybe you're from a more affluent family when you're born, but you don't do well for yourself, and then you sort of fall down that ladder. And this is an image of toys because social stratification also exists for gender, but we've really talked a lot about gender and things like that and things related to gender throughout the semester, so I won't talk about that for now. Social mobility is a change in class position from one's family of origin. So again, thinking about this achieved system versus this ascribed system. And there are different types of modality that are highlighted in chapter 9 of your textbook. All right, so moving on and thinking about more definitions from chapter 9 of your textbook, we have to think about poverty and wealth. So absolute poverty is deprivation so severe that it puts day-to-day survival in jeopardy. So you're at risk for not getting your basic food, shelter, clothing needs met because of how impoverished you are. Relative poverty is a different form of poverty where you may not, your sort of basic needs are met, you can eat, you have shelter, you have clothing, and all of those things, but you don't necessarily have the means to live the lifestyle of the average person in your country. So perhaps in the United States, you're at the poverty line and you receive assistance, food stamps, and that sort of thing. All of your basic needs are probably going to be met, but there's going to be a level of precariousness or a level of insecurity because you're not necessarily sure if at any given moment you're going to lose access to food, shelter, or clothing, or maybe you're living, you're couch surfing, you're living with a family member, and there's 7 of you living in a 1 or 2 bedroom place, that sort of thing. And then wealth is the value of money and assets a person has. For example, inheritance or salary. So it's not just income. Oftentimes when we think about socioeconomic status, we think about the profession someone has and how much money they make annually or their income. But when we think about when we think about socioeconomic status, it's more important to think about wealth. And so that also includes more than just income. It includes these assets, the houses and cars that you own, the investing in the stock market you might do. And actually, those other things related to wealth outside of income can matter a lot more for socioeconomic status, because if you have a good job and a good profession with a high paying salary, but you grew up relatively in relative poverty, and that's sort of what you were born into, it's much easier to, have something come up that puts you at a disadvantage from a class financial standpoint than if you have a good job in a good field that pays well, but you were born into a family that's more affluent, and so you have all these assets, you have intergenerational wealth, if you will. If something were to happen to you financially, you'll probably not go down the socioeconomic status ladder the way your coworker who is from a more impoverished background might. So it's important, wealth really becomes important when it comes to that. Okay, and then finally, class and systems. So class and class systems. A class is a group who shares a common social status based on factors like wealth, income, education, and occupation. And then a class system is a social standing based on social factors and individual accomplishments. We also have a caste system, which is similar. In some countries, rather than have a class system based off of socioeconomic status, there's a caste system, which is a system where people are born into a social standing that they will retain their entire lives. So regardless of accomplishment or merit, no matter how well you do for yourself, if you were born to a poor family, you will always be in that lower caste system. We see this, for example, in traditional Indian culture. Meritocracy is a system wherein people succeed based on their talents and their achievements. Now, in the United States, we like to think that it's really easy for people to move up the socioeconomic ladder if they have merit. But in reality, even if you do really well for yourself, you study hard, you work hard, it can be very difficult to climb the socioeconomic status ladder in the United States. There's this myth in meritocracy. And a lot of that comes from the American dream, which is the idea in the United States that if people work hard enough and pay their dues, they'll achieve their goal in the end, often a goal related to financial success. And so these two things are kind of connected. I believe the American dream is not a definition from chapter 9 in your textbook, but to me, I think it goes along really well with meritocracy and this idea of social class and having a system based off of social class. So I've included it for our lecture. All right. I try to keep it brief since we're really honing in on discussion posts and the rubrics and how to do that properly. So make sure you review the hard copy rubric and guiding documents I provided for students a couple of weeks ago. Make sure you come prepared with the material and need to work on discussion post number 6. And make sure you do your exit pass after our in-person session this coming week, week 8. Keep reading, bring what you need to work on for discussion post 6 this week. Um, the discussion post is about surviving minimum wage. Have a great week. I will see you all soon.